Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. Today I'm going to create this ocean shaker card with an alcohol ink background. I'm actually going to use alcohol inks to create a few different backgrounds for a few different uses. Two of them I'm going to be using in this video. The others will be set aside for a couple of different cards, so they won't go to waste. I'm going to be using this Oh Whale stamp set. It has some adorable little images as well as perfect sentiments. Then I'm going to be using the casted net stencil for a background. This is the one that I'm not going to be using for the card that I'm creating in this video. I have a few different surfaces I'm going to be working on. Firstly, I have some alcohol ink cardstock. And what I'm doing with this is I'm going to create a background for doing my stamped images because I like the way that alcohol inks look. I thought it would be a more interesting background for those stamped whales rather than just using plain cardstock. So I'm using alcohol ink cardstock. This is a glossy finish cardstock. It is porous, so those alcohol inks do sink into it, but it's got a beautiful glossy finish to it. That alcohol ink that I used for that was Slate, and I used it with some isopropyl alcohol and then used a alcohol ink blower tool just to move it around. Now, one of the things I love about Slate alcohol ink is while it's gray, it has some other color tones that come out of it when you're moving it around. So you'll see a tiny little bit of a blue tone in some areas, and then there's some areas that have a little bit of a tan brown tone. So it's got some really great color variations that make it perfect for this and perfect for the whales. And I only did it to the bottom half of that cardstock because I want to do the killer whale on the top, and I wanted to have a plain white glossy surface for that. I'm not going to be using all the whales on the card, but at this point I hadn't decided which one I wanted to use on this card and which ones I wanted to use on different cards. For the next surface, I'm working on some clear alcohol ink Duralar. It looks like acetate, but it's Duralar. It is heat resistant, so I can emboss on it later, which is going to be important for some of the sentiments, but it's a perfect surface for using my alcohol inks on. These come in a package that are 5x7. I'm cutting them in half, so they're 3.5x5. They're going to work perfectly in what I'm creating or what I'm using them for. So I have 3 different shades of blue here for the alcohol inks. I have aqua, turquoise, and stream. I am using the isopropyl alcohol on the top. I have it in a Mighty Mister because it's got an extended spray on it. You can use it in whatever spray bottle you want, but it's a great way to cover the surface with some isopropyl before adding the alcohol inks. That isopropyl is going to help them move a little bit more. And because I'm using just alcohol inks, I can use inexpensive isopropyl. I don't need any specific blending solution for that. I'm using regular alcohol inks for this because I love the transparent look of them. For creating water for the background of my cards, this is going to be absolutely perfect. So my second background is going to be created fairly similarly. That first one, I use that blower tool in order to move those alcohol inks around. The second one, I'm just lifting them up, moving them back and forth, and yes, I'm using my fingers. Yes, you can tell by my fingers, this does stain your fingers, so if you don't like that, you can make sure to wear some rubber gloves in order to protect your hands. I usually don't remember until after I've got my fingers stained, and then by that time, it's a little bit too late. I can also use that isopropyl alcohol to clean that alcohol ink off my glass surface here, and it's really, really easy to clean up. Now, the third surface that I'm using is some Yupo. This is a plastic paper, so this works great for alcohol inks as well, and this is where I'm going to use it with that casted net stencil. Using alcohol inks for backgrounds with stencils creates some really cool looks to them. So I'm laying my stencil on top. I am spraying it with that isopropyl alcohol. And then I'm going to be dotting my alcohol ink on top of that stencil as well as that Yupo cardstock. That alcohol ink is going to pool underneath that stencil. I'm going to leave it there to completely dry. And yes, I'm going to use that blower tool in order to move those inks around. I want to make sure that I get a nice, smooth, oceany looking surface, but it's going to have that cool texture of that net. Another option would be to say use some browns or tans for that net. However, mixing them with the blues, you're going to get a little bit of a muddy look. So I prefer to just use it with the colors that I want for my background and have that texture in the background. So I leave this, once I have it how I like, I leave it to dry, and it probably dried for about an hour. Now it's not going to dry 100% because the stencil is plastic as well as that Yupo paper, but it is going to dry a lot of those surfaces that were exposed to air. The rest of it I can set aside to dry. And like I said, I'm not using that background in this video, but I did want to share it because it's a great way to use that stencil. It's a great way to create a different background with alcohol inks, and I love the effect. To clean up that stencil, I use that same isopropyl alcohol. I'm using a microfiber cloth for my surface as well as the stencil. Later on, I will be using a microfiber cloth for cleaning off my stamps. I'm using a completely different one. This one has alcohol ink as well as isopropyl alcohol. When it comes to cleaning off my stamps, I'm going to just be using a microfiber cloth dampened with water. So I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not using that same cloth throughout the whole video. You can see once my stencil is clear, there is a tiny little bit of a blue tone to it, but it's really pretty clear. It doesn't stain my stencil. I think if you use really dark colors, you might get a little bit of staining on there, but even if you did get a bit of staining, it doesn't affect the usage of that stencil, and the effect is absolutely worth it. This is great. That stencil background is a great one to use with many different color palettes. So I haven't used this Whale stamp set before, so I am using a white eraser on the stamping surface. This removes any possible manufacturing residue, and then I use a soft brush to remove any of that. I do my entire stamp set, so once I go to use this set again, I know that I've done it once. I never have to do that again. So I take the 3 whale stamps, put it on my alcohol ink background here, and I'm going to stamp this with some Versamark ink and heat emboss it with black embossing powder. This alcohol ink cardstock you can easily heat emboss on. It can handle that heat. So this is going to make the outlines of the different areas of that whale raised. So it's going to give it that extra bit of texture. I'm doing all 3 at the same time. Like I said before, I hadn't decided yet which one I wanted to use for this particular card, but I knew I wanted to create some other cards with those whales, so I wanted to have them all done. So when I positioned those whales on that background, I just looked at the texture of that background and chose where to put those whales because of that. I did use embossing powder tool on this background because with that alcohol ink, sometimes there's little resin in there that doesn't like to quite dry. I wanted to make sure that the embossing powder was not going to stick to those areas, so that embossing powder tool definitely helped. I poured the embossing powder on my stamped images and then tapped off the excess and then used my heat tool in order to melt that powder. It looks like my heat tool is right up close to that alcohol ink cardstock or that embossed image. It actually isn't. It's several inches away, but by the camera, it looks like it's totally close to it. Now, there was a couple areas on that killer whale that got missed with the Versamark ink. I just used an embossing pen. This one happens to be a distress embossing pen, but you can also get them in a Versamark form. I colored those areas that were missed and put that embossing powder on there and then heat it up again, and it looks like a complete image now. So in order to create my cards, I want to fussy cut these images. So I'm cutting just outside that embossed line. When I do my fussy cutting, I am angling those scissors so the bottom blade is underneath my image. I'm also pretty much keeping the scissors blade and my hand with the scissors in one position. I'm moving the cardstock, I'm not moving the scissors. So here we have that first image. I'm going to continue doing the rest of them. I'll do most of that cutting off screen because it's fairly repetitive. The technique is exactly the same. Now, one thing you may want to do before doing that fussy cutting is put a sheet of adhesive on the back like Sue Kwang so that it creates basically stamped image stickers. That way, when we go to create our cards later on, you're not going to see the adhesive on the back of those pieces. I had intended to do that, but forgot about it until after I had them all cut. And by that time, it was too late. But I just wanted to leave that suggestion that if seeing the adhesive or the glue on the back of it bothers you, by putting a sheet of adhesive on that piece before doing your fussy cutting, that will solve that problem. It'll turn it into a sticker. Now for my background here, I'm going to create a shaker card. So I have an oval die cut already cut for that shaker card frame. I wanted to add a sentiment on my water here. So I'm using the embossing powder tool on that. I am stamping it with Versamark ink, and I'm using my Misty stamping tool so that I can stamp that image a couple times, make sure I have a nice crisp sentiment on there and then using that same black embossing powder. I think white embossing powder would also look fantastic here. I chose to keep it black to tie in with the lines on the stamp. Now, like I said before, Duralar is heat resistant. It's not heat proof. So when I'm embossing with Duralar, I am making sure to keep that heat gun moving around so that I don't melt the plastic or don't warp the plastic too much, because you can do that by leaving or by moving that stamp or by moving that heat gun around. It just disperses the heat a little bit better. Then I stamped one of the sentiments on the inside of my card. I just used some black memento ink for that. It didn't need to be anything fancy for the inside of the card. And I used some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to glue that frame down onto my Duralar alcohol ink background. And then I'm going to set those aside to dry. I put the whale on there at the same time. At this point, I had decided which one I wanted to use, so I chose that beluga whale. Now, by gluing it onto that Duralar, it's going to take a little bit longer to dry because the glue is only drying from the cardstock side. It's not drying from the plastic side underneath, so you do want to be patient with it, but it will dry. Once it is dry, and you can tell by looking on the back that glue goes from white to clear, you can use some scissors in order to trim around that. Now, if I had wanted to, I could have taken one of the oval dies in the set that I used for this and die cut that Duralar. It does die cut. I wanted to leave enough space so that I could pick and choose where that oval went. So I opted not to do that. It's a very simple shape in order to cut around anyways. For my shaker box, I'm using some thin foam tape behind that die cut oval. Now my tape isn't really thick here, so once I have that first layer down, I'm going to be taking the backing off and I'm going to be doing an additional layer. When I do that additional layer, I stagger where the joins are, kind of like if you're doing a brick wall, you don't have all of the ends of the brick at the same spot. So it just makes it so that it's a little bit more strong, if you will. Now, the other thing I did was die cut an oval that's just a little bit bigger than my shaker box and glued it to my A2 card base. This is just going to give it a frame around that oval. I wanted a color that was light enough so it wasn't going to change the color of my alcohol ink background drastically. I wanted it to complement it, but I didn't want to have that frame around there just to kind of frame it in a little bit. So once I have that tape on there, I'm using a bit of embossing powder tool on that foam tape. Sometimes the adhesive peeks out the side, and by using that embossing powder tool on there, I can make sure that these sequins are not going to stick to it. So I have some opalescent confetti embellishment pieces here. I'm going to put that piece on there. However, I forgot to take the backing off my tape and I realized it pretty quickly. It's going to work a lot better once I take this backing off the tape. Now I put those opalescent pieces on the center part so that when I glue this down, I'm not gluing any of that foam tape right on those pieces there. I can make sure that they're all enclosed in there. And you can see that those opalescent embellishments you can see it right through that alcohol ink Duralar. It's not distracting in the fact that it's completely different color. It really enhances it. It adds a little bit of sparkle. It adds a little bit of movement to that card. Now, as an alternative for the shaker card, you could always take that casted net alcohol ink background with the stencil and flip that or use that for the background for the beluga whale, put the sentiment on a separate piece of cardstock and attach it to the front. So you have two different ways to create this beluga card. I always love shaker cards, interactive cards, but I also love having different alternative ideas as well. Thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate the time that you spend with us. Have a fantastic day.